How can a country that owns the largest oil reserves in the world be broke? Venezuela, once called the Dubai of Latin America, is now synonymous with economic collapse, hyperinflation, and mass exodus. What looked like a blessing turned into a curse, corruption, the rentier model, and poor decisions transformed black gold into poison. But here's the thing, this isn't just Venezuela's story. It's a warning for any nation that believes natural wealth guarantees prosperity. What happened there can happen elsewhere, and that's why understanding this case is so urgent. How can a country that owns the largest oil reserves in the world be bankrupt? That's the question echoing in the mind of anyone looking at today's Venezuela. The answer lies in the so-called resource curse, a phenomenon where abundance, instead of bringing prosperity, generates economic collapse, corruption, and dependency. It's almost like winning the lottery and spending it all without thinking about tomorrow. Easy wealth becomes a trap, and the rentier model turns into a straitjacket for the economy. In the 1970s, for example, Venezuela was already seen as an emerging power. Compared with countries like Norway, which also relied on oil, the difference is striking. The Norwegians created sovereign funds, saved for the future, and diversified their economy. The Venezuelans, on the other hand, spent as if the barrel price would never fall. And when the party ended, the impact was brutal. Hyperinflation and the lack of planning created the foundations for the collapse that would come later. It's curious to think that the same natural resource can be a blessing for some and a curse for others. Imagine two neighbors who inherit millions. One invests, learns about the market, diversifies, the other spends it on luxury cars, trips, and mansions. Soon, the first keeps growing, while the second is drowning in debt. That's the picture of Norway and Venezuela. And the story was only beginning, because the discovery of black gold would soon change the country's destiny forever. In the 1920s, Venezuela stumbled upon a treasure that seemed endless: oil. Suddenly, an agrarian country with few industrial prospects started receiving foreign capital flows like never before. It was the beginning of the oil boom, and Caracas started transforming into a vibrant metropolis, seen as the Dubai of Latin America. Streets filled with imported cars, skyscrapers rose, and the rentier model created the illusion of infinite wealth. In the following decades, the state consolidated itself as the great distributor of that fortune. Oil not only filled public coffers but also financed a life of appearances for political and business elites. Meanwhile, the population got used to subsidies, government jobs, and cheap imports. It was a dangerous cycle. Abundance disguised economic fragility, and no one wanted to talk about diversification or productivity. After all, when black gold was flowing, who would worry about agriculture or industry? Many reports from the time describe Caracas as a showcase of modernity, where artists, intellectuals, and businessmen gathered in fancy cafes. But behind the scenes, dependence on oil was already creating invisible cracks. Like a house built on sand, all it would take was a shift in the wind for everything to collapse. And that wind was coming, ready to reveal that the golden age had an expiration date. But oil came with a dangerous dependency. The Venezuelan state controlled over 90% of the country's exports, concentrating the economy on a single resource. This rentier model turned the government into a wealth distributor, financing subsidies, inflated public salaries, and cheap imports. Over time, agriculture, which represented 25% of GDP in the mid-20th century, fell to less than 5% in the 1980s. Industry followed the same path, unable to compete with foreign products bought with petrodollars. When oil prices crashed in the 1980s, the impact was devastating. Without reserves, the government turned to international loans and tried to impose austerity measures dictated by the IMF. Those measures, such as raising public transport fares and cutting subsidies, directly hit the poor. The result was the Caracazo in 1989, a wave of massive protests that ended with about 300 to 500 dead according to official data, though independent organizations report up to 3,000 victims. It was the brutal picture of economic collapse and the exhaustion of an unsustainable model. This period could have been a turning point. Countries like Mexico renegotiated debts and diversified production, Chile invested in structural reforms and trade liberalization. Venezuela, however, clung to its oil addiction, like someone living forever off an overdraft. The economic collapse had already shown its claws, hyperinflation loomed, and people were longing for a savior. It was the perfect stage for a figure who promised to rebuild the nation under a new banner, 21st century socialism. It was in this climate of disillusionment that Hugo Chávez emerged as the savior of the nation. In 1998, he came to power promising social justice, a fight against corruption, and a break with the political elites that had failed for decades. With oil prices soaring in the early 2000s, Chávez found the perfect fuel for his projects. Thus came 21st century socialism, built on nationalizations of strategic sectors and social programs that, at first, won the hearts of much of the population. Oil once again became the golden goose. Between 2003 and 2012, Venezuela earned more than $1 trillion from oil exports. That money was used to fund social missions in health, education, and food, which did bring short-term improvements. But there was one problem: everything depended on the mood of the global market. Every drop in oil prices shook public finances. It was like building a house of cards on top of an oil rig. Nationalizations increased the state's control and scared away foreign investors. Major companies left the country while the private sector shrank. Chávez reinforced a narrative of sovereignty, but in practice, the country was walking into dangerous isolation. The curious part is that, from the outside, Venezuela seemed to be living an economic miracle. But beneath the surface, the rentier model, corruption, and populism were eroding the economy's foundation. And when the winds changed, that castle began to crumble. 2014 was the breaking point. Oil prices plunged from over $100 per barrel to under $40 in just months. With that, the house of cards built during Chávez's era began to collapse. The dependency on oil was exposed. Without revenue, the government could no longer fund social programs or maintain the imports that stocked supermarkets and pharmacies. Economic collapse wasn't a prediction anymore, it was a brutal reality. Hyperinflation hit like a hurricane. In 2018, accumulated inflation surpassed the absurd mark of 1,000,000%, according to the IMF. Imagine receiving your salary in the morning only to find out in the afternoon that it couldn't buy even a bag of rice. Bolivar bills became practically useless, sometimes used for crafts or wallpaper. Shortages reached critical levels: hospitals without medicine, empty shelves, endless lines for basic food. It was the materialization of an economic collapse without precedent in the region. To make matters worse, international sanctions tightened the noose. Foreign companies left, investors vanished, and economic isolation deepened. Corruption devoured what little trust remained in institutions, while the government hardened its authoritarian stance. Venezuela, once one of Latin America's most promising economies, had now become synonymous with humanitarian crisis. But the impact wouldn't stop at economics, it would soon become deeply human, hitting the lives of millions. Food shortages reached dramatic levels, with families surviving on just one meal a day. Hospitals ran out of basic supplies, doctors fled the country, and once controlled diseases like measles and malaria spread again. The collapse of the healthcare system became visible even to those who had never set foot in Venezuela. Images of malnourished children and empty shelves circulated worldwide, exposing the depth of the humanitarian crisis. The Venezuelan exodus turned into one of the largest population displacements in recent history. It's estimated that over 7 million people have left the country since 2015, seeking refuge in neighboring nations like Colombia, Brazil, and Peru. Personal stories of sacrifice multiplied, entire families crossing borders on foot, skilled professionals working in menial jobs, children growing up far from their homeland. It's a diaspora that mirrors other human tragedies, marked by loss but also the hope of starting over. And the question remains, can Venezuela still rewrite its story? After all, the country still holds the largest oil reserves on the planet. But without responsible governance, without fighting corruption, and without diversifying the economy, black gold will remain more curse than blessing. The Venezuelan case is a harsh lesson for any nation dependent on natural resources. The question is, who will learn from it and avoid repeating the cycle? Now tell me, what would you do if you had the planet's greatest wealth in your hands and still watched everything fall apart? Venezuela's story shows that oil alone doesn't guarantee a future. Without management, it's just a ticket to economic collapse, hyperinflation, and humanitarian crisis. It's a wake-up call that forces us to reflect on our own choices, whether as citizens, entrepreneurs, or leaders. And if you were there, facing empty shelves, worthless salaries, and the need to leave your country just to survive, what would you do differently? This provocation isn't only about Venezuela, it's about how all of us need to see beyond the short term, fight corruption, and not fall for the illusion of easy wealth. If this content made you think differently, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. That way, you'll keep learning about the forces that shape our world and apply this knowledge to your own life. Because, in the end, understanding these stories isn't just culture, it's survival.